For the same reason with the first bosses, we want to make a list of the best first dungeons, because they're often overlooked as well, both by us and others when it comes to ranking the best or favorites.
Maybe they aren't really overlooked, but they usually have a low chance to make it high because the beginning of the game is usually very easy and straightforward to make the player get familiar with different game mechanics.
Which is sometimes unfortunate, because there are a couple of really good ones out there. There are different factors that come to play when we rank these dungeons. We can like them because they actually have a good tutorial for how the game plays, but we might also want to include those that don't feel like a tutorial, and rather throw a dungeon that feels like a challenge your way.
They just have to be memorable in their own ways, even if they're super easy or actually fairly difficult as a first dungeon. So let's get on with it. We're the owners of Triforce, I'm Owner 1.
And I'm Owner 2, and this is our list of the top 5 first dungeons in the Legend of Zelda series.
Starting off on this list is Skyward Sword's Skyward Temple. The name is a bit different from the usual forest-named first dungeon formula the series often follows, even though it's actually placed in the forest.
Skyward Temple is actually a fairly challenging first dungeon. It wasn't very huge, but it made great use of the little space it felt like it had, like most dungeons in Skyward Sword. It was pretty complex for being the first, with pretty good puzzles and enemies.
What it does well as a first dungeon is of course to have us try out what makes Skyward Sword differ most from the other games in the series, the motion controls. It must be said that Farum Woods already lets you try out the swinging of your sword and shooting with your slingshot, but it's more up to the test here in a place that feels like it's all the more necessary that you master these skills.
This dungeon feels pretty dangerous, and it has surprisingly ominous music in the background as well. It has natural elements that could very well be in the forest, like the trees, vines, mushrooms and water, in addition to enemies like the Skulltulas.
In addition to this though, it also introduces a brand new item never seen before in this series, the beetle. This is a very important item to the entire game, and you really get to try out what this thing can do inside of this temple. And unlike many people, we actually appreciate having to visit this place one more time later in the adventure.
It does a lot of things well for a dungeon, and especially for a first dungeon. And while this one is very enjoyable, there are some dungeons we either like better or think do a better job for what it's supposed to be.
The 2D games have a lot of good tutorials in their first dungeons, and it might be easy to think that since we're huge fans of A Link to the Past, we would put the Eastern Palace or Hyrule Castle on this list, but the one that lands our 4th spot is one from a pretty overlooked game in the series, which will be Minish Cap and its Deepwood Shrine.
This dungeon works really well on a lot of levels. First of all, when it comes to the game's main features, it instantly shows the effect of the most important aspect, with that being how it can shrink down in size. In the human world, the Deepwood Shrine is nothing more than a slab of stone. However, when you're the size of a Picori, it's actually a pretty dangerous and well-made dungeon.
There's not a lot that really makes you feel small inside here though, until you face the boss, the standard green choo-choo, that appears to be big. But if there is one thing, it's the barrel in the middle of the dungeon, which is actually a great thing about it.
The barrel has a lot of openings in it, and it can roll around, which makes this a point where you gradually can go multiple ways after getting a brand new item, which adds to the fair complexity this dungeon has.
The gust jar is also interesting and put to good use here, as it removes little squares of dust and webs blocking doorways. The environment here is pretty cool with how weird it is to think that there are actual structures that are this small. And the elements you find around here with mushrooms, water and wildlife is also really interesting.
With this also being a fairly challenging dungeon for being the first as well, we really feel it deserves its spot on this list.
Next up is the Willful Temple from Majora's Mask. Instead of being a plain forest-themed dungeon like most others in the series, it's more of a swamp-themed one. We've seen clean water in most of the other forest dungeons, but this one has poisonous water that needs to be cleansed as you move on.
It also feels much more tropical with the flowers that you can use to pop out of with the Deku mask, in addition to how tribal this place feels with the music in the background, the boss being a jungle warrior, and the totem poles placed around.
Another thing we really like here is how the place is really dark. Some rooms have everything lit up, but there are also some really dark rooms that makes the place feel pretty dangerous. It feels pretty hostile when the enemies are all kinds of dangerous creatures, and when even nature itself can kill you.
The dungeon is not very easy and linear, especially for the first dungeon, and what it does well with being the first in this game is also introduce the side quest of collecting stray fairies, and that the dungeons have a formula with up to 2 mini-bosses each.
This dungeon also has you finding the bow, which honestly is one of our absolute favorite items in the series, and makes good use of it. It's great to take out enemies with, to hit other targets with, and even solve a few puzzles with.
And of course, this is the place where the Deku mask is put up to a big test. Sure, you played through a couple of days as a Deku already, but this dungeon also sets up the mechanic of playing as both human and transformed Link, and being able to constantly switch between the two inside the dungeon.
It offers great atmosphere, introduces us to a number of mechanics found in Majora's Mask, and it's also one that offers a good challenge as your first step into the dungeons this game has to offer.
Of course the Great Deku Tree has to be here. While it's found to be very easy, to which we can agree, there are so many other things this place does well as a first dungeon.
While the previous dungeons haven't acted as much as a general tutorial to learn the simple ways of playing the game, the Great Deku Tree actually does that. It has Navi explain to you how the environment allows you to climb on stuff, or how you even open a freaking door. Which, yes, seems simple to us now, but we have to imagine being back in 1998 to really see why we find this to be a great first dungeon.
This is the first dungeon to actually present an environment in the third dimension in this series. A lot of things were new to the players back then, but the controls wasn't the only thing that was new. This dungeon also started the formula of the first dungeons in the series often being forest themed.
And what a way to do that! It has you enter inside a freaking tree, the Great Deku Tree, who's actually also a central character to the story. This place is very atmospheric with its music and surroundings, with this place also being filled up with the kind of enemies that feel natural, like arachnids, plant monsters, and other small weird plant beings.
It also brought in a special way to take advantage of the third dimension, with what many people seem to find very memorable by having you jump down from a great height and through a huge spiderweb to proceed further through the dungeon.
It's probably the easiest dungeon on this list, but when it comes to the atmosphere and the things it did to introduce many new staples to the series, Inside the Deku Tree gets the number 2 spot.
Most of the dungeons we've gone through here have worked as a tutorial in some ways, and this one might do that to a certain extent too. However, this definitely didn't work much as a tutorial for the entire game in the same way, as it really brought a challenge our way and rather paved the way for the great lineup of dungeons this game had to offer. This is Twilight Princess's Forest Temple.
What we mean here is that this game has to go through a pretty long opening sequence before you reach the first dungeon. You get to learn attacks with your sword, shoot with a slingshot, ride a pona, and even how to play as a wolf beforehand. In other words, pretty much all the basic mechanics this game has to offer is already gone through before you enter the first dungeon.
Meaning that the Forest Temple actually acts more like a second or even third dungeon when it comes to complexity and challenge. It's not really a hard dungeon, but it's also in no way a very simple one like most others. You have a clear objective in this place where a bridge breaks because of the mini-boss, and you have to rescue a bunch of monkeys from imprisonment in order to have them help you get across.
To rescue them, you have to go through a pretty complex dungeon with several directions to go both indoors and outdoors, fight a lot of enemies, and solve some really good puzzles to reach the boss.
The atmosphere here is really good too, with you walking around inside giant hollow trees and the windy outside, and even experiencing standing inside partially destroyed trees. The music feels sort of natural and adds to the atmosphere, and much like the previous dungeons on this list, the enemies feel like they belong here, and this does sort of feel like a real temple with totem poles standing around.
Here you also need to use different items, like the slingshot, bombs that you find inside this place, and the Gale boomerang that you can pick up after ridding Ook of that parasite thing on its head.
This dungeon is pretty long too, and far from a dungeon you can easily breeze through. This feels like a real dungeon that almost could have been any other than the very first. So even if you enjoy tutorials sometimes and how first dungeons allow you to understand the whole game better, we also appreciate a good challenge, and this dungeon really did give a great start ahead of all other great dungeons that are to be found in Twilight Princess. That was our list of our favorite first dungeons. Remember to leave a comment with your thoughts on our picks, and of course leave your own favorites in there as well. Don't forget to give this video a like if you thought it was good too.
And if you choose to subscribe, well, you won't get to see a whole lot the coming month, because we, and probably you as well, will be playing Breath of the Wild. So we won't be able to create a whole lot of content because of that. But we will be back with videos from this game when we figure out what lists we can make. We'll see you again soon, and we really hope you enjoy Breath of the Wild as well.